and comparing across outcomes. So not only where is the evidence, but also, what is the magnitude and significance of the evidence. And, in this kind of area, of course, there may be so many different kinds of outcome measures that it's difficult to do this, but at least in a kind of qualitative sense, we can think about doing these kinds of summaries where we would show sort of the direction of the evidence and the significance of the evidence and the gaps in the evidence in this sort of a more qualitative approach. So once we think more about the 800 estimates that we put into this database, and we see where there are gaps and where there are lacks, you have a lack of significant findings, you can also start to you can categorize what you see in the patterns. So you can look at, is there a lack of evidence because there's a lack of instruments or a lack of meaningful instruments? In which case then it's actually not an evidence gap, it's an MBI application gap. Or is it a matter of that the instruments are in place, but they just are not effective enough to find anything significant? And that would be shown both by the significance and direction of the estimates. It could also be shown by looking at whether there's publication bias, because we all know it's easier to publish something if we can show something significant. And then the last area is, if we know there are a lot of instruments and there's no reason to believe that there's a publication bias or that basically the instruments are just so defective that they're not worth analyzing, then we can also find the analytical gaps. And those analytical gaps can really orient our future work, considering methodological limitations. And the methodological limitations in this field, of course, are not insignificant. I mean, first of all, when we're thinking about things like efficiency and dynamic efficiency, what is our point of comparison? Is it a simple, without intervention type of comparison or control, or is it that you actually need to have a command and control alternative to make a relative appraisal? When we think about market-based instruments, a lot of them are applied blanketly by governments, at least in theory, so there's no defined eligibility criterion or population to which it only applies. And so then what you have is you have a very limited number of units of assignment, as we would call it in impact evaluation, and that's what we would end up calling a small n intervention. You have a small number of treated units of assignment, and then when you start to consider the clustering in those units, you don't have any statistical power to use empirical, traditional kinds of econometric estimates. You also often have things where the effect of the instrument would create interaction effects for those who have less exposure to the instrument. And when you have these kind of interaction effects and general equilibrium effects, our way of thinking about things in kind of standard econometrics and empirical work is that you have a standard unit treatment value assumption that you have an absence of these effects. If those effects are there, then it becomes a real problem for typical empirical models. And then you have all the data problems that are typically present for measuring actual environmental outcomes. So we have these considerations. I think it's a useful way of framing how we move forward. I think it's very exciting if we can come up with a testing agenda for market-based instruments. And we have to frame that testing agenda around the analytical gaps and not the implementation gaps. So once we've identified what's been done but we don't know about it, then that's where we can frame things. When we can focus on things where there are very strong behavioral assumptions about how people respond to an incentive or a measure, whether they substitute as expected, whether they have rebound effects so that they don't comply as expected, or there are other unintended outcomes, then I think it's very exciting to try and think about behavioral experiments. Of course, those experiments are only applicable for things where they're not the small n interventions, where you have enough treated units of assignment that you can get statistical power. So things that you could vary among villages, households, enterprises, etc. And it's not going to be the things where we have the big general equilibrium effects. But there are still lots of things in this category. So we can think about, for example, irrigation water pricing. With smart irrigation, as we're doing in Bangladesh, you can individually vary the volumetric price to which farmers are exposed. You could do it in terms of land tenure. Land tenure often isn't changed. Land certification, land rights are not issued blanketly to populations overnight, so it's possible to either understand where that will happen first or even randomize it. Energy pricing, again, it's possible to vary it among different populations. And there are tons of programs out there in Asia that are subsidizing assets that are believed to have environmentally beneficial outcomes. And it's possible, again, to vary those kinds of subsidy programs. And it's very interesting. When you actually look at responses to prices to which people are exposed, we as economists tend to think that people are going to behave very logically, that they are going to basically display the kind of response in terms of the marginal benefit that we would expect. When you get into actual behavioral work and you can vary the prices to which people are exposed, they often do not behave as we would rationally expect them to. This is from a totally different field, this example, but this is from health. All of these kinds of health interventions that you see here are things that have huge benefits for households. They're preventative kinds of investments. But as soon as the price moves away from zero, demand drops off dramatically. And that demand response is a much steeper slope than we as economists would expect based on the marginal benefit of what's being done. So to understand how people respond to price incentives, we need to move beyond simple economic assumptions based on logic, and we need to actually test. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to everything. There are a lot of small n interventions, and some of them would not have the general equilibrium effects that are problematic. And in those cases, synthetic controls does offer us a new option. I was very excited to see the case study on the carbon markets in China. I think this kind of work where we apply synthetic controls is very exciting. So synthetic controls basically creates a synthetic comparator population through an optimization algorithm before the intervention that puts a weight on potential donor comparators so that it replicates the trends in the treated unit. It's a quite new technique. It's only become really popular in the last 10 years, but it's a new tool that offers new options. Of course, there are also going to be the really problematic things, which are the small n interventions with general equilibrium effects, where we can think about maybe more application of interrupted time series approaches. If we have lots of observations over time, there's more and more high frequency data becoming available. In some cases, we will have to go back to structural modeling, of course, but we can improve our structural models. So I think this report and this work is a beginning rather than an end. There are a lot of exciting things that can be done, both with the database that's built and as follow-up. So I think one of the really strong messages also out of this report is that although there are many no-regret options, there are also few really simple blanket silver bullet solutions that apply to all the different problems, and that we need to do a lot of testing and customization to understand what mix of instruments is going to work well. And so then that opens up, I think, a very exciting avenue of potential research studies. And I think it's really exciting where we can do piloting experiments, and we can think from the beginning about how to test the different measures in place. Doing that is not something that any academic can do alone. It's something that we all have to do in partnership because it requires the governments that implement the policies to be on board with a testing and learning agenda. And as a final note, I would like to say that I was really excited to hear the last presentation about Vietnam, because to me, that opens up lots of possibilities of things that we could actually be testing right here in this country. There is variation in terms of land market registration and participation in land market registration and incentives for reporting land transactions. There are many, many different incentives offered for, say, clean energy development that could be tested in various ways. You have differences in water pricing policies that are applied in different locations and deviations from market prices. You have mining deposit fees and ways in places where it's inadequate versus where it's more adequate to shift behavior. In terms of the level of payments for forest PES schemes and what's incorporated, there could be many exciting examples of what can be changed in terms of levels and inclusion of benefits like carbon. There's an interest in developing new market-based instruments, all of which could be tested. And there was also in the final slide an emphasis on behavior rather than fiscal revenue recovery. And it's exactly behavior that we would want to test with these kinds of experiments. So I think there's a really exciting future of what we can do in this area. And I'm very pleased to be able to offer my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is open to the discussion, and while we're waiting for the staff of the hotel to arrange the chairs here, I received a special request from the audience to, actually it's not from the general audience, but specifically from Professor Sheldon here, to invite Professor Thomas Sterner to give us an honor to have a brief discussion of the paper, of the document leading into the discussion this morning, if possible. Thank you, Professor. And I'd like to invite all of the presenters this morning to come up to the stage. And please be seated. And somebody will help circulate the microphone so that the audience can raise questions. Once again, please come to the stage, Professor Shulin, Mr. Isao Endo. Of course, Jessica is not here, so Professor Shun Wu, Mr. Wayne Huang Nam, and Mr. David Razor.
So thanks Gunnar for inviting me to give some comments. It's very exciting to do so. This has been my favorite subject for a few decades, and it's nice to see just how big it's become. I want to start by advertising my book, since I have a book on policy instruments actually in Vietnamese. I don't know, it's a guy called Phuong who translated it, and I haven't been able to find him, but I'm hoping to meet him on this trip somehow. So when I actually sat I think in 98, 99, and did research on this book with Mike Thoman, who's here in the audience. He invited me to RFF, and I also sat at the World Bank and wrote this book, the first version in English, and it's since then it's been updated by Jessica Correa. There's a second edition, and there's different language editions in Chinese, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So we already heard some great comments. I'd just like to add a few. There's a lot of different ways of categorizing environmental problems and environmental instruments, and you can categorize them by whether they're point sources or non-point sources, whether the damage is heterogeneous or not, and whether the marginal costs of abatement are the same or not the same, all kinds of things like that. I think for practical purposes, today I'll just choose one division, which is between the really big ones in terms of potential revenue and the other ones that are not going to generate a lot of revenue, but which still can be very important for the environment. So in the first category, we have, of course, everything related to climate. Carbon pricing, maybe in some cases even some non-carbon pricing, methane pricing in the future. But basically just carbon pricing or energy pricing. This is related to a lot of local air management and traffic and industry and stuff. But this has the potential to generate very large amounts of revenue, and I'm later going to say that I think we need to think about process, and so here the relevant process is we need to collaborate with ministries of finance as maybe the main force, because ministries of finance are very powerful, and so you have to go into that knowing that you're going to be talking to the Ministry of Finance. Then we have a lot of, in some countries, mining can generate very significant resources, or could. Very often this is unexploited, and for instance, my own country, which loves taxing things, but we don't tax minerals like we should. We just give away the resources, and I think that's quite a mistake. So there is, and forestry is another case. In many cases, many countries, forests are publicly owned or stand on public land, and the sometimes concessions to harvest are just given away or priced very inefficiently, and there's significant possibilities for revenue. So again, the Ministry of Finance should be involved, and together with ministries of, say, forestry or natural resources. So that's one category. There's another category of very important issues, which is to do with, say, waste handling, water management, and so on, where you probably will not generate significant resources. The Ministry of Finance is not going to be interested. Still, there are resources that will be generated, and for instance, fees can be a very useful instrument. So in water management, you can have collection of effluent fees or water fees, and these fees can be often recycled within a ministry or within a local municipality or regional agencies or whatever there are, and that's the two categories, I think. One additional principle I'd like us all to remember is that the level of the fees is very important. We tend to fall into, it's a bit of a trap to be like biologists, and we look at all these different kinds of market-based instruments as if they were different kinds of plants or birds, and we start collecting maps of how many you have in different countries, and you get these tables, which we've seen many examples of here. And we should remember that's all very well, but it's just a step. And the most important thing is really to have sizable fees. The level of the fee is very important. And I've seen many of my friends in the IPCC, for instance, they like coloring in maps. And it's a bit like children coloring maps, you know. It's fun. But you see more and more countries have carbon tax, but it's a carbon tax of $1 or $2 or something, and sometimes they have a subsidy at the same time, which is bigger. That's not a real example of a carbon tax, right? So we have to be interested. We need carbon taxes that are really quite high to deal with climate change. So it's much more important to focus on the level. So level is a word I want everybody to remember. The level of the tax, or the level of the price, if we're speaking of a fee. It's more important than anything else. And then we need to think of how we get to this level. So the next word I'd love everybody to remember is political process. As economists, we tend to have sometimes a bit too much of a social engineering approach to this. We optimize the instruments. But political scientists and others remind us that the important issue is really to get the right stakeholders into the room and to create the legal and procedural foundations for a process for these different stakeholders to arrive at a workable instrument. And there will be lobbyists in this process. Lobbyists are strong and very often quite negative, but they can also be positive. And either way, they need to be handled, and we should not be naive about the way in which lobbyists operate. Lobbyism is very important, as are a number of other things like property rights. And I'm often fascinated and a little bit worried when I hear the idea of using a tradable permit for something like air quality in a country where you don't have private property for land. If you don't have private property for land, I don't think the general public and the businessmen and the consumers are very used to the concept of how markets work. And if you don't have private property for forests, for land, for such things, then I sometimes wonder whether starting with air quality is really the right starting point. And in those cases, there might be other instruments like fuel taxes, which would be more appropriate because it's a whole procedure. You think I'm speaking too long? I just started on it. Okay, let me stop with one thing, and that is that we're speaking not of a small, but of a very big field here. Asia and policy instruments to solve environmental problems. We need to approach this in terms of a grand experiment. Think of a 10-year program. Maybe the ADB could lead this or facilitate it, but we need a dozen universities, we need a dozen ministries to collaborate, and we need to test things and to evaluate and do research. We need to have research that is both academic on the one hand, but also practical policy research where you actually have people who are employed in ministries involved, and all that for basically each area, for water fees, for mining fees, for forestry, for carbon pricing and climate. So this is a program of several large programs, and it's not something that is finished, but it's something that is just started here. And so, yeah, thanks. I echoed many of the comments that already that some of you said. I'm aware of that. But anyway, thanks.
I'd like to take questions for the presenters. You may have questions to specific presenters. You can have questions to all of them.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hoai from Central Institute for Economic Management in Vietnam. I feel a great honor to be here today to get to know about the project. I think it's a fantastic project, and I agree with David that this is the most comprehensive and systematic research project on the market-based instrument, and I think it will contribute a lot to the cause of the sustainable development in the region as well as in the global. I think I find the most interesting on the project is the that it tries to link with not only the academic research, but also policy-oriented research. So I think from the policy point of view, I would expect the project to have a broader aspect in terms of the market-based instrument, in terms of the way to look at market-based instrument. Because as you know, from the policymaker point of view, whenever you would like to apply any instrument or policy, you will need to look at not only one aspect as environmental aspect, but also in terms of the social equity aspect, and also in terms of the economic growth aspect. So from this, for example, in Vietnam, we know that we need to reduce subsidies for the electricity power. But we cannot do it right now because it may affect on the inflation and on the sustainability of the economy. So from this aspect that I recommend to add one more aspect in the analytical frameworks of how to choose or to select the market-based instrument, and also how to the factor affecting the performance of market-based instrument. That to add one more aspect, that is a development context. It's not only the environmental characteristic. It's not only the institutional characteristic, but also the development context. So that is one point. And the second point is also from the policy point of view, I would expect that the research in the future of the project will focus or do more research in terms of the policy impact assessment. As one presenter also pointed out, this is one of not only few research on this aspect, but also it's also very important for when you would like to introduce a policy to instrument into the reality. You need to do impact assessment. It's not only the ex post impact assessment, but also the ex ante assessment, impact assessment, meaning that to do the impact assessment before introducing the policy. So I think that is my expectation. And also one more thing is that in addition to what you mentioned in the report, you will present the low-hanging fruit option, and together with that, I would expect you also present some best practice in applying the instrument. It will be very useful because when you apply one policy, it depends on different context, different various factors. So you will see, if we have the whole picture, we will see how it's applied in the real world. So finally, congratulations. I think it's a great project, and I look forward to the future research. Thank you.
Can I respond quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, well, let's hope we can have more questions and comments. We're running out of time. So, yes, thank you. These are, of course, incredibly insightful comments. When it comes to the analytical framework and what we actually looked at, of course you're right, and we had such limited time today to go into this. So one thing that we were acutely aware of when we went into this, given decades of research on this in the past, is also the political feasibility of the implementation of, for example, carbon taxes that has been discussed, or subsidy reform. And that is typically very much related to distributional implications too, right? So this is something that we have tried to bring in both kind of throughout in the text, but specifically in the 8 case studies, that it's its own kind of annex of 100 pages back to back with the report. So I can only say that yes, you're right, and this is, you know, really fundamental, and it shows just the complexity of what we're looking at. A brief example, Thomas put together experience from fuel taxation and how it affected the poor in 25 countries, and found that, you know, despite what, you know, all these riots and so on about the potential impact of the poorer the country, the more progressive are these taxes, right? But still there is rightly a concern of particular policymakers when it comes to the implications. And we have yet another example. Mike Toman is here, is leading a study in Ethiopia with a very elaborate dynamic CGE, computable general equilibrium modeling of the distributional implication of a carbon tax, right? So I think that also policymakers, they are acutely aware of this, and our role as economists will be to, as well as possible, actually give the best possible evidence there so that they can take this decision, because they are much more concerned about those things than the kind of optimality that David was talking about.
Okay, Hoi, thank you for your question. I think I should give also the background that Hoi and CIEM have been a research partner of ours for many years, and I think there's some background also to her question in that she has done this kind of dynamic CGE modeling for Vietnam, where we looked at low carbon development options, and we did an estimation of marginal abatement costs for specific levers, a bottom-up analysis, and then Hoi ran it through her CGE model to look at the distributional effects of the package of measures that we had put together. So I'll just respond on a few things of what Hoi said. I generally agree with your comments. I think a lot of the contextual things and a lot of the differences in the instruments and what has conditioned effectiveness where evidence is available would be useful to further flesh out. On the ex-ante assessment, I would say there are 2 elements. One is purely ex-ante work would be, as you termed it, impact assessment, and we can do that with structural models, and also when we're talking about sort of general policies that affect an entire country, where you have these general equilibrium effects, where there's small interventions that may be the only option. So impact assessment is very valuable also to address these distributional concerns. Impact evaluation, which I would say is empirical estimation of treatment effects and their statistical significance, is also useful to do, but then obviously it can't be purely ex ante. You need some pilots. But I think it's wherever we can, I think it's useful also to do that. But it won't always be useful. So in some cases it may only be the modeling-based type of approach. Thank you.
So maybe cross-country comparisons, that's what we can bring to this analysis.
Before questions start again, I'd like to remind you to briefly introduce who you are and which organizations, institutions you are at. Any other questions, please, sir?
I'm Mike Toman from the research department at the World Bank. In the spirit of this being not the end of a study, but the planting of seeds for a longer-term discussion, Thomas actually said the points I wanted to say mostly more eloquently than I could, which is typical. But I just wanted to underscore 4 points that are in the category of making sure you keep track of the broader policy framework and connections when one does analysis of market-based instruments. One is that if there are large tax subsidies for pollution control equipment, that has an effect on how market-based instruments are going to turn out in terms of their cost effectiveness, because they'll inevitably differ in terms of their tax treatment. One might want to get rid of those tax subsidies over time. Second, where you have a lot of state control of a sector, either because it's regulated or owned, I think it becomes very problematic to use quantity-based approaches. Everybody's excited about the Chinese national cap and trade system. It's in one sector, electricity, vertically integrated and owned by the state largely, not exactly the most bright setting for a market. I think when we have these situations, and I understand in Vietnam there's much intention now going into equitization, I believe is the term of art for state enterprises. This may be the perfect setting for really using a price-based approach, a carbon tax, a pollution tax, a water fee, et cetera. With revenue-generating instruments like that, we have to be very thoughtful about earmarks because that can often lead to inefficient or even perverse alternatives. And finally, in the comments that were made about encouragement of solar energy here in Vietnam, first of all, I think we all have to remember that subsidies generally are harder to implement than prices if we want to try to target them well. Second, we should try to have technology neutral instruments where we can because we don't want to necessarily choose one technology over another. And third, when we look specifically at solar, it's well known that there are some very substantial cost differences between rooftop systems and utility scale systems. So if we're going to have some reverse auction or any mechanism to try to encourage those investments, we should certainly try to encourage the ones that seem to make the most economic sense in addition to a good environmental sense. Otherwise, we end up like some countries in Europe with very large expenditures on not very cost-effective ways of providing green power.
So there was no question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jorge Bonilla from the EfD Colombia. Thank you, interesting presentations. I have one question related to the whole topic about policy dialogue and how to design very good policies for market-based instruments. In the case of Colombia, we have identified that there are several constraints to implement policies to cut pollution for the air, for water, or waste. But the situation is that these three main constraints are political will. The second one is the institutional coordination, because some of these topics like air pollution, water, it's not only handled by one sector, you have to involve several sectors at the same time. And the third main constraint is that there are national policies. When you, for instance, in the case of air pollution, you say we have to impose taxes for air pollution, and you have to pay using the principal pays case. But in this situation, sometimes the policy includes the word taxes for air pollution, but it's difficult to translate this tax to the local level because it requires to develop in detail the law. And it's difficult even if we have, for instance, some cities that would like to be ahead of the rest of the country. They cannot do any policy related to that because they have to wait until the government develop the details of the law. So these three main constraints, for instance, in the case of air pollution, working in that topic, it's difficult when you go to a city and they want to cut pollution. It's difficult because they don't have a way to get out of this situation. I don't know if you have some recommendations for that, how to deal with these three constraints, or maybe if there are other constraints that you think that are very important for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the presenters. A very interesting presentation. My name is Somanath and I'm at the EfD Center in India. I just wanted to say that regard to research going forward, I think one of the things that really is very crucial to examine is the incentives of various players in the system. And in particular, I think that what's missing from most of the analysis by economists of policy instruments is the incentives of politicians. So the incentives of people within the government to take actions. And those incentives vary quite significantly depending on the level of government, for example, that they are at. Whether it's local or state or national, it depends. It varies enormously across countries, varies very much with political systems. So if you have a political system in which the government, the ruling party is basically stable and it's going to be there forever, then the incentives of players within that system are much more long-term relative to a system in which there are regular elections and then governments change very frequently. So if governments are changing very frequently, then incentives of politicians, you have to have, whatever policy you're proposing, it better have results very quickly before the next election. So those kinds of things, change the picture completely differently. And so certain kinds of instruments aren't going to work. And then if you want to think about this, it really matters, the distributional effects of any policy and how those are handled really become crucial to whether that instrument is even worth talking about. So I really think that going forward, we want more systematic research directed in this direction, and I don't think we can leave it to political scientists and say, well, it's their business. Because this is fundamental, right? Economists are all about, if we learn anything from economics, it's about analyzing the incentives of the actors. And we really need to analyze the actors' incentives. I don't want to say that that means only the incentives of the political leadership, it's also incentives of other players in the system and how all of those incentives can be aligned. And usually there are going to be several different actors with regard to a particular policy or a particular sector, all of whose incentives have to be aligned before you can implement a particular instrument and make progress. And I think the fundamental difficulty with many of these problems that we have in Asia with regard to air pollution, water pollution, waste, is that the damages are very diffuse. They're very diffuse, they accumulate very gradually, then they get up to a level where the stock of pollutant is very high. Any policy that addresses that will have to draw that stock down. That's going to be gradual, which means that you are only going to see benefits gradually. It's not going to be dramatic. So getting the incentives aligned so that all the actors in the system find it in their interest to act in a way to get that to happen, I think that's the big challenge, and I think that's where more research is needed.
So should give them a chance to say something more. When do you close? When do you close the session?
It's about 12:20.
Okay, so in case you leave.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your comments, suggestions. I really appreciate it. I think this is more than science. I take your point. We need a good science policy interaction. On behalf of ADB, I would like to make a few points. I thank you, all of you, for your great contribution. I'm really happy to come here and see you. I see a lot of potential that we can go even further. I would like to emphasize that our position following our new strategy 2030, we ADB continue to help support sort of applying and scaling up these innovative approaches of market-based instruments. And I think it's important, as most of you mentioned, that we need to sort of test, apply, and examine the efficacy of these instruments. That's necessary. And I think I'm glad that we have a good resource that can make it possible. We have not only scientists, economists, but also government officials and other partners like the World Bank, United Nations. I think we can build on those strong foundations to use to advance our initiatives. And again, as I mentioned, I think it's important to continue this kind of science policy dialogue. And I'm glad I met a lot of people who are engaged in EFD. Maybe this can be a great platform to sort of initiate and continue that momentum. And lastly, I would like to call for sort of continuous collaboration among us, consisting of different people with different backgrounds. And I would like to hope to continue to sort of engage with you, and I look forward to working with you in the future as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That a lot of the point made by people in the audience. I think that indeed this is important to look beyond certain set of indicators. That including static efficiencies, dynamic efficiencies, and efficacy. I think there's a lot more, I think, values at stake here in applying market-based instrument. There are, for example, revenue concern for government, and can be itself important consideration, and the equity concern of using these can be another important concern here. So I think in the future, definitely it's important to look beyond. I think it's sort of indicated that that looking at from economic analysis perspective. On the other hand, also I think it's important to recognize that there's not just simple dichotomy between command and control and the market base. There are range of other policy instrument out there, right? The legal approach, right? You can civil law and the criminal law and these, and also organizational restructuring can be a very powerful instrument as well. There's a range of and also community-based approach. So this is also important to open it up, looking at a wide range of instrument beyond market-based instruments. So really kind of you can appreciate both the usefulnesses of market-based instruments, but also understand what are the relative shortcomings in comparing with other instruments. For example, this study may indicate in some areas, government may have no choices but to strengthen their command and control measures here. So perhaps in the short run, the assessment is that those cap and trade system may not work well, or expect to work well in the next 5 to 10 years, so that more efforts need to be paid on command and control and do it well. And the other aspect is also, that the market-based instruments are very rarely used by themselves, standalone. They typically are actually combined with other instruments here. So this is actually create both opportunity in looking at the policy mix, but also create a measurement issue when we look at the effectiveness and so forth, whether or not it's really the combined effect that is important, or you can looking at the effect stand alone from a particular market-based instrument. I think this also creates some measurement challenge here. Okay, so that's my comments.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I very much agree with the last comment of the audience that he mentioned about the incentives. And at the end of the day, I think market-based approach, as I mentioned in the slide, is all about incentives of stakeholders that we want to care about, and we want to motivate the economic incentives of stakeholders and everyone regarding to the work environment and environmental management. Maybe in the future we will find, down the track of the approach, market-based approach, we may find some new instruments and some new solutions on the way. And I very much agree with the idea that we have to analyze the incentives of the government and the states as well, and cannot agree more. Firstly, we We know that the government in Vietnam, the government wants to promote market-based approach just because we have a limited budget and we want to socialize the work to protect the environment and mobilize the resource from the whole society. And that's the first incentive that I mentioned. But there will be many other incentives that will lead to some more ideas on the issues. And again, I hope that on the way we will find some more instruments and some more solutions for the issue. Thank you.
We may have time for the last question from the audience, and I'd like to give a microphone to a lady here.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, I think it's a great report. I'm Saudamini Das. I'm from India EfD Center. So I think, this is for the first time that you are seeing a review of all the Asian countries, and it has the potential of being used as a textbook, a reference material in the universities, because almost every university is offering an environmental economics course, and they don't have a one reference where all the countries are being evaluated and assessed. I think we really need to put some work and make it as a textbook for the university. That is one. And then the one more suggestion I have: can you make it as a business case? Because like when you say government, okay, you are not doing well, they don't listen to you. But then you want to say that, okay, you have done this and this is what you have achieved, and if you go one step further, this is more you can do it. In waste management, we see a lot of business case because there are so much of employment is being generated, energy is being generated, and some of the waste management settings have become self-sufficient in energy. And similarly, if you can make a positive case, tell them that, okay, every problem is giving you a scope to do better. So I think that may make the policy more interested in, adopting some of these measures.
Can I just conclude? I think we need to stop if we are going to have lunch today, and there is a new session starting out at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much. So we already have a second edition of the policy instruments, so maybe this will feed into a third edition for Thomas and Jessica to consider with a special edition for Asia with all these case studies. Of course, we would love to do this also for Latin America and Asia, and really start a collaborative on this issue. I think a lot of really good points have been made, and maybe you will hear me echo this on national television tonight. What Professor Shun was talking about, it is a very gradual process. We have to learn as we go, and also we might. What has become very clear in this process is that we're also talking about policy mixes. So we see these kinds of strands coming out. It takes time, gradual process, a lot of learning and mixes. And I think that what we have here today is, a very, very important ingredient for us to be able to speed up this process and really address these environmental problems in a very concerted way. In that case, we need to, as researchers, we need to do our part and get really involved in the process if we are going to save this environment and have a more sustainable world to live in. So with this, I would like to thank you all for making it all the way here to Hanoi today. It's been a fantastic start of the Policy Day and of the EfD annual meeting, and I hope that many of you will join the Marine policy session. It's really starting at 1 o'clock.
Well, I think we should have a 1 hour lunch.
So Nam is there. He's the general here. So let him. 1 hour lunch.
1 hour lunch, and my clock shows us it's 12:20. So let's make it at 1:20. Okay. Back in the room.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The lunch will be served is Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you back to the room for the policy dialogue all-day session on the interaction between academics, researchers, and decision makers, policy makers. And I have to apologize for the delayed start of this afternoon session because we, as you can guess, we ended this morning session very late. So it took us some time for lunch. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Håkan Igor from the Marine Program at the University of Gothenburg to have a welcome speech or remarks, and then to start this afternoon session on marine resource management. And again, I'm sorry to introduce myself. My name is Nguyen Lo, and I'm from the University of Economics, Ho Chi Minh City. Today I serve as a discussion moderator and the guy who flags the time to the presenters. Please keep the time to 10-15 minutes so that we will have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you very much. And please, Professor Håkan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's very special for me to be here, and particularly since I brought my friend and colleague Chris Anderson from the US. When I grew up, there was still a war in Vietnam, so that was a big thing when I grew up, also in Sweden. So we went on a bicycle ride yesterday, and it was just fantastic to see the countryside so close to Hanoi in Vietnam, and it's kind of, I'm very happy to see how well Vietnam has done since 1975, the official peace day in Vietnam. So it's great to be here on a peaceful mission and to talk. And the reason I'm here is thanks to Environment for Development and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. So a part of the Environment for Development is the newly started marine program. And it's great that we are part of the policy day when it is in Vietnam. I'd just like to say that I'm in charge of this program together with Francisco Alpizar from CATI and Costa Rica. And we have two major areas. I mean, saving the oceans is like, there's a lot of work to be done. But we are focusing on the one hand, fisheries and aquaculture, which is the topic of today's afternoon session. But we also work with marine plastic pollution. And yeah, I just want to show a few slides before the next speaker takes on, and then I'll come back later on. So why is it good to be in Vietnam? Well, it turns out if you look at capture fisheries production, Eugenia, can you see this slide? Yeah, so it's barely. I mean, it's, I excuse, it's always a problem. You want to squeeze in information into a PowerPoint, and it may not that easy to read. But it's the top 10 capture fisheries nations around the world, and you see that Vietnam is number 8. So Vietnam is a major contributor when it comes to capture fisheries production. When it comes to aquaculture production, it's even more dominated by the Asian countries. And in this respect, Vietnam has had, like many of the other countries, tremendous growth. You see the first column from 1995, total aquaculture production in Vietnam was 381,000 tons. And in 2016, the corresponding figure was, if I see right, 3.6 million tons. So a dramatic increase over just about 20 years. Finally, the thing that we're not going to talk about here today, marine plastic pollution. Again, Vietnam is among the top nations. Maybe not so good, but that is a fact. As we all know, a lot of the production for all global consumption is based in Asia today. So China is the country that, according to this study, published in Science some years ago, you see that Vietnam is number 4 in terms of marine mismanaged plastic waste, and how they define that I will not go into details. But so for that reason, I'm very happy that we have this marine program, and even more happy that we have the EfD-Vietnam, and the director, Nam, is present here. So that's good, and I hope that we will have a fruitful collaboration between EfD-Vietnam and the rest of the EfD centers, and of course also with policymakers in Vietnam. So ending there, I hope I kept my time limit for the introduction. It's now time for the next speaker. But I won't dare trying to pronounce the name, so I leave that to our moderator. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I'd like to invite Mr. Van Vik An from the Fishery Department, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. He's going to share with us the marine resource management in Vietnam. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Would you like me to present in English or in Vietnamese, please?
I would like English.
Any objection from the Vietnamese delegates?
But maybe you can mix.
Okay, so mainly in English, sorry, we have the dominate of the foreign people here. So I'm sorry for the local people. So you have to be hearing from my translation service. So sorry, I'm presenting in English. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here to present about the capture fishery sector as well as the aquaculture. So you know from the previous professor talking about our fisheries sector. So you can see this is some summary information about the geography, and we have the 82,000 million people in our population. And the total area for our country is 300,000 square kilometer, and the coastal line is very long, so it's more than 3,000 kilometers for the coastal line. So that is the key thing is how the potential of our fishery sector is developed. And of course, our economic exclusive zone is more than 1 million square kilometer, and in terms of we have a lot of Iceland in our EEZs, and that's why the very high biodiversity in our marine ecosystem. So this is a map exactly indicates us our fishing area. You see in Vietnamese we divided by 3 fishing areas: the coastal area and the inshore area and the offshore area. So we divided by different zoning area. So this come from our degree. But just to remind you that this is information using we have the our fishery law is established in 2003, and this map following the our fishery law. So actually we have the new one, already adopted by the National Assembly. So it's 2017, but the new law is not yet implementing. So just information here, I just present according to our
fishery law in 2003. So you see this the map is still according to the our fishery law, divided by 3 fishing zones. As I said, it's a very high biodiversity. We have around 11,000 tropical marine species in the marine water. Also, more than 2,000 for marine fish, 130 species with very high commercial value, and 30 species is regular export by capture fishery. So we also the very big Mekong Delta River is a very good area for the aquaculture. As you already know, that the covers areas more than 40,000 square kilometers, and a lot of river, lakes, and other natural body of the water located in the inland area. So this is talking about the capture fishery, and later on I will be talking about the aquaculture. So we divided by the capture fishery and the aquaculture. So some information about the capture fishery. You see this is the number of the fishing fleet fishing in our area. So this can I go cheat? So this seems still under our law. We have the decree number 33 indicates that the offshore fleet is considered for the vessel with higher than 90 horsepower. We consider this horsepower, so the engine of the vessel. And if the vessel less than 90 horsepower, we consider it's a small vessel. So we have 2 categories. The one is small and the other one is larger, 90 horsepower. We consider it's a large vessel. And you can see it's, there is decreasing in terms of the total fishing fleet from 2011 to 2017. So now we have around 109,000 in total in the small and large fishing vessel. But the small one is, you see, is decreasing. But the big one is almost stable, and sometimes it's increasing. So you can see here is the big one. That's more than 90 horsepower. In terms of the number by gear type, so we have several gear type. Too many traditional, additional fishery in our country. But summarize, we just have some big fishing gear. For example, the big one is, sorry. You see the gear net is very big, in 44% in 109,000 fishing vessels. So you can imagine that more than 40,000 vessels in targeting on the gear net. And the trawler is one of the big issue because you know the trawler is catching everything in under the water. So it's very impact fishing gear. So now the government tried to control, to reduce the number of trawler. But you see, according to the statistic, it's still very high in the total of the fishing fleet. And other gears, percent, hook and line. Hook and line is also a very big one. And we have the tuna. I mean, this is I consider it's the oceanic tuna. We have 2 kinds of tuna. So one is coastal tuna. I mean, how can I say? It's small tuna, and the other one located in the offshore area or in the very far from the coastal. So we consider it's oceanic tuna. In Vietnam, we have. I'm coming back to with the tuna fishery in Vietnam. It's I think it's very important economic fishery in Vietnam. You see, yeah, right, exactly here. This is oceanic tuna in Vietnam. So in terms of we have 5% of the total fleet, but in terms this is the number of vessels. We have three gear targeting on the tuna fishery, tuna species, hook and line, gillnet, and the percenter. So 3 gear, and you can see the variation for the different fleet, and actually we have see the percent a little bit decreasing, but the hook and line is the big hit here in 2017. This is the catch, the oceanic tuna catch. So this is, we are the cooperating member of the Western and Central Pacific Commission, the regional fishery management organization in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. So we are not a full member, but we are cooperating member. This we call the CNM. So on the oceanic tuna fishery information, we need to report to the WCPFC. It's Western and Central Pacific. So this is the total catch that we already provide to the WCPFC for the regional stock assessment already. So you see the increasing trend in, for example, the gillnet here, very big increasing, and the other gear also increasing. But for the hairline, is almost stable. The 01 is stable in our total catch. This is by species, the catch by oceanic tuna species. So when you see the oceanic tuna in the WCPFC, you have only 4 oceanic tuna species: the big eye, yellowfin, skipjack, and albacore. There are 4 species managed by WCPFC. So in our water, we only have 3 species under 4 oceanic tuna. So we have big eye, yellowfin, and skipjack. This is information exactly similar to this one, but it's categorized by species. So the total is now we have in 2000. This is information for 2017. We have almost 110,000 metric ton. That is a total for 3 species. So this is summarized for all the marine aquaculture and inland fishery. So this is the total catch. You can see the marine catch increasing, and also the aquaculture is also increasing trend. So just some information about the export value for tuna. The tuna is the key species in our country. This is a very important, very high economic value species. So the total export for 2017 is almost 600,000, 600 million US dollar. So it's contribute very high in terms of the economic value. So this is only for tuna, one species, the key species in our country is. But just remind us, this is not only for our catch, our domestic catch, but we that we have the import catch from other countries. So this is the total export is including the domestic catch and the import catch. So we import the raw material and we processing here. We have a lot of processing plant here in Vietnam. So it's and then we export. So this is the total export, including the import raw material and the export. I'm sorry, the domestic catch. So we combine everything. We have got almost 600 million. Sorry. This is the export for tuna as well. This is I'm coming for the aquaculture now. So because I have very limited time, so you see this is the aquaculture area for the shrimp and pangasius. This is a key species in aquaculture in Vietnam. So this total farming area for pangasius and shrimp is 1,100 hectare, 1 million hectare. So sorry, this is time 1,000. So we have 1 million hectare for shrimp and pangasius. And this is for aquaculture area for shrimp. So this is almost 700,000 hectare. And the production for the pangasius, you see this also very high. We have the area here 6,000 hectare, and the total production for pangasius is 1.2 million metric ton. So it contributes a lot for the aquaculture in Vietnam. So this is the production for the shrimp aquaculture. You can see it's very high production. We have this is main two species, white leg and black tiger species. This is because sorry, this is my main professional is in capture fishery. So I get information from my colleague from on the aquaculture. So this is information just for the information, but I get the information from my colleagues. So I don't have any more explanation. You can add later, but I'm not in the main background in the aquaculture, so just very information. This is the production for the pangasius. Here, so I think the organizer already provides a presentation for everyone. So if you want to have a look, detailed statistics, so you can get from the organizer. So it's just very quick. Export for shrimp is very important. Export for the shrimp, we export a lot in European Union and ASEAN, China, and US. That is some key market export. So you see the total exports for shrimp is 3 billion US dollar, more than 3 billion, nearly 4 billion US dollar in 2017. So it's very high value for shrimp. And this is pangasius. So this is more than 2 billion US dollar, the total export for the pangasius. This is our structure, the institutional arrangement. So we have the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development here, and under the province we have the coastal area, coastal province. We have 28 coastal province. So under the Ministry of Agriculture, we have only one research institute, and the Directorate of Fishery managing for the producing the legal framework, and this is institutional the research to provide the scientific advice, and another sector for the managing the quality control. So that is the institutional structure for for capture fishery as well as aquaculture in Vietnam. So some legal framework. I'm not talking very detailed. So it's a list of our legal framework for the capture fishery, and this is for aquaculture. So too many legal document here. So this is, as I said, this is from the new, from the old law. But now we are developing the legal framework for following the new fishery law. So we started to effect in the 1st January 2019. So this is based on the old law. And as the professor already indicates, as I think this is I got the data from the FAO 2016. So this is the Vietnam located here. So we have following China, India, just for aquaculture product, and for marine. So also we are the third country in aquaculture. So you can see it's very important for in terms of the capture the fishery sector in Vietnam. But you know some issue. So I just list to have any comment and any opinion. So the overfishing, of course, in the coastal area, we have a lot of fishing fleet, 109,000 vessels. So it's a very big one if we have any overcapacity. There's a CPE, the catch per unit effort. So you see this is the green one is the CPE, and the red one is capacity. So increasing the capacity, but I mean the catch, and the green one is CPE, so it's decreasing. So it's monitoring, controlling surveillance. So how we can control the capture fishery sector, and also the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. So it's a very well-known concept in our own area. So the bycatch environmental issue, and how you use the market by measure. So it's, I think now it's become very popular now, using the market by measure, and the compliance. So we can list all the issue here, and then we can have a chance. You can discuss about the issue. For aquaculture, the overcapacity, this is the cooperation in the supply chain, the capital investment, finger line, the quality of the finger line, and also using the international standard. So it's that's the recommendation for the discussion point. I think it's come from the organizer. They asked me to find out something for discussion. So just list on the aquaculture and the capture fisheries, so for everyone to discuss. And finally, the standard, the certification system. So we know that we have the two kinds, the compulsory certificate, and the other one is non-compulsory, I mean the voluntary. So we have to follow the compulsory, and then the non-compulsory is for the business to business, I mean to B2B. So here in the capture fishery, we are now using of course, the EU regulation 0.005. That's every country we want to export to EU, so you have to follow this regulation. Of course, it's for traceability and eliminate the IUU fishing. And then the ICAT also the compulsory. Just you know, the ICAT is international convention commission for the Atlantic tuna. So it's ICAT for swordfish, and the big eye tuna also need to be. If you want to export to ICAT member countries, so it's for the traceability and sustainability. And the other non-compulsory is the don't fish. So don't fish also compulsory. So if you want to export to US, so you have to follow the regulation. The marine stewards stewardship culture, MSc, everyone already know in the capture fishery. So this is the voluntary standard, of course, for sustainability. And finally, the EII. This is also the voluntary certificate. And I want to emphasize about another private standard for the aquaculture. The first one is for capture fishery, and the other one for aquaculture is we are now a lot of producers are using the global gap for aquaculture. So the global gap have all from compound fish manufacturing, the seedling, the production, and the chain of custody for the company. So this on the supply chain in the aquaculture sector. So using the step by step for the global gap certification system. So thank you very much. I think that's end my presentation. Thank you. I think, do you have any time for the question? Or later? Okay, thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Christopher Anderson from University of Washington. He's going to share with us about fishery performance indicators, which I believe is demonstrated on his clothes, as well as on a coming presentation, if I'm right. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. This is my first introduction to the EFD program, and it's been, thank you very much, Hakan, for inviting me in. This has been fun, and I look forward to continued engagement. This is my third trip to Vietnam, and I very much enjoy being here. I've had an opportunity to visit Vietnam and do some tourism and be here in Hanoi, and other times I've been able to go to Ho Chi Minh City and Cat Tien National Park and spent time in Nha Trang. This is a wonderful place to work and been really impressive over the last 10 years to see the growth in the country and how fisheries and resource management is contributing to that growth. Hakan asked me to pull together some recent research and data and maybe use it to teach some lessons as part of this talk, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. So what I'm doing is going to pull from a recent paper that we've published using the fishery performance indicators, and I will tell you what those are in a moment, and use that to explain the bioeconomic model, or explain the results that we see with the bioeconomic model, which is one of the models that I teach in my undergraduate class